Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be trying to wrap our heads around how a potential second Trump administration could impact developing Asia.
Sounds pretty heavy.
It is. But lucky for us, we've got this Asian Development Outlook December 2024 report. It's from the Asian Development Bank, and it really digs deep into a bunch of scenarios.
That's what's so great about this report. It doesn't just throw out possibilities,
Right.
It tries to help us see what could actually happen if these policies actually took effect.
So before we dive into all of that, what does the economic landscape look like in developing Asia right now?
So picture this. Steady growth, but we're starting to see things slow down a little.
Okay.
Kind of like when you ease off the gas a bit.
Right.
Domestic demand is still going strong in a lot of places. People are buying stuff. Businesses are investing.
Which is a good thing.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay.
And exports are doing their part too, especially in tech.
Tech.
Yeah.
There's always a but, isn't there?
Right. Some warning lights are starting to flash. Demand is weakening in some key export markets.
Gotcha.
And that's where a second Trump administration could really shake things up.
Let's talk about some of those potential policy changes.
Yeah.
The report flags protectionist measures. What exactly are we talking about?
Okay, so think about tariffs, those taxes on imported goods.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine those going way up, like potentially 60% on imports from the PRC,
Whoa,
and then something like 10 to 20% on imports from everywhere else.
that's huge. I mean, I can't even imagine how global trade would even work if that happened.
Yeah, it would be a complete game changer.
Wow.
And it's not just tariffs. Okay, the report says the U.S. might even review existing trade agreements and consider a carbon border adjustment tax. Things could get very complicated very quickly.
So beyond trade, the report also highlights immigration as a potential game changer.
Yeah, if Trump gets a second term, reducing illegal immigration is going to be a top priority.
I see.
So think deportations, tighter borders, maybe even that wall will be back on the table.
Yeah, I was wondering if that was going to come back up. But seriously, that stuff wouldn't just impact the U.S., right? It seems like there'd be ripple effects everywhere.
Absolutely. I mean, it's all connected. Labor markets, economic output, you name it.
Mm.
And on top of that, there's the potential impact on fiscal policy, specifically extending the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Right, those tax cuts. That could really throw things out of whack when it comes to inflation and interest rates, huh?
Absolutely.
Okay, so to help us make sense of all of this, the report lays out two scenarios, a baseline and a risk scenario.
Yeah, and I think they're super helpful for understanding what could actually happen.
Okay, so break those down for me. What's the difference between those two?
Think of the baseline as a kind of gradual, partial implementation of those policies. It's like slowly easing your foot off the gas.
So it's like, okay, things might be okay for now, but then there's the risk scenario. What does that one look like?
The risk scenario is like slamming on the gas. It's like, what if they just went all out with those policies?
I see.
That's when we'd see more immediate, dramatic changes.
Okay, so with the baseline scenario, what does developing Asia look like in the short term?
Well, you might think you'd see some immediate impact, but the report suggests it would probably be pretty muted at first.
Interesting.
It's kind of like a delayed reaction.
Okay, and so when would we start seeing the real effects of those policy changes?
We'd probably start seeing the real fireworks around 2026 and beyond. That's when the full effects would really start rippling through the global economy.
Okay, let's move to that risk scenario. What happens if those policies are implemented aggressively? Would it be total economic chaos?
Well, it wouldn't be total chaos, but the report does predict negative impacts on global GDP growth.
Okay.
But the silver lining here is that the effects overall are predicted to be relatively modest.
Modest. What does that even mean, in real terms?
Yeah.
For people in those countries?
We're talking about a cumulative decline of something like 0.5 percentage points over 4 years.
Okay.
So not a global recession, but definitely a noticeable slowdown.
Right. And I'm guessing that wouldn't hit every country the same way, right?
Yeah.
Some would be worse off than others?
Definitely. The report suggests that the PRC would likely get hit the hardest. We could see their cumulative growth drop by 1.2 percentage points.
Wow. 1.2 percentage points.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty big. What would that actually mean in terms of jobs, businesses, just people's daily lives?
You'd think their weaker currency would help, but those tariffs would probably cancel that out. We could see job losses, businesses struggling, a general decline in living standards.
Okay, so the PRC takes a hit. What about the U.S.? Do they come out of this unscathed?
Not really. I mean, even the country putting those policies in place can feel the effects, right?
Right.
The report predicts U.S. GDP growth would decline too by about zero point 0.7 percentage points over 4 years.
It's interesting. It's like those policies boomerang back and hit them too. What about the rest of developing Asia? How would this risk scenario play out in those economies?
Well, the report says that East Asia, because it has such strong ties to the PRC, would probably experience a decline too, like a domino effect.
Right, if one of the big players goes down, everyone feels it. But hold on, you said earlier that some parts of developing Asia might actually benefit from all of this trade war stuff.
Right.
How is that even possible?
It might seem counterintuitive, but think about it. Businesses are going to be looking for alternatives to the PRC, so they might shift production and investment to other countries.
Okay.
Lower labor costs, favorable trade deals, wanting to, diversify their supply chains. It all adds up.
So South Asia and Southeast Asia could benefit.
Yeah.
That's pretty surprising. Okay, so we've got these winners and losers in this potential trade war. What about inflation? How would that play into all of this?
Inflation is a bit of a mixed bag. The U.S. and the PRC could see some serious inflationary pressures. Tariffs driving up import prices, looser fiscal policy, putting more money into the economy, labor shortages pushing up wages.
Yeah, so basically, everything gets more expensive.
Pretty much.
Okay, but what about the rest of developing Asia? Would they be hit with the same inflation?
It's a tug of war. A stronger U.S. dollar could make imports more expensive.
Right.
But then slower global growth would probably lead to lower commodity prices, like oil and agricultural products.
Okay, so it's like those two forces kind of balance each other out.
Exactly.
Okay.
But there's a big caveat here. All this analysis relies on a lot of assumptions, like how big those policy changes will actually be and when they'll happen.
It's like trying to predict the weather in a chaotic climate system.
That's a great analogy. And then there's the wild card of a potentially more dovish Fed that could throw a whole other wrench into the work.
Yeah, the report flags that as a major risk. Can you explain what a more dovish Fed even means? Why should I even care?
Okay, so think of the Fed as like the conductor of the U.S. economy.
Okay.
They set the tempo with interest rates. Now, a dovish Fed is one that's more likely to keep those rates low, even if it means risking a bit of inflation.
So lower interest rates in the U.S. Why is that a risk, especially for developing Asia?
Well, lower rates here can make investments in developing economies seem more attractive.
So more investment should mean more growth, right?
You'd think so, but too much money flooding in too quickly can be a problem. It can lead to asset bubbles.
So like when stock prices or real estate get way too high.
Exactly. And if those bubbles burst, it can have serious consequences.
So we've talked about trade, immigration, and monetary policy. What other potential risks are we looking at?
Well, the report highlights a potential shift in environmental policies under a second Trump administration.
Like what?
It could mean a step back from climate change action, which is a huge deal, especially for developing Asia.
I mean, this might seem like a bunch of abstract economic stuff.
Right.
But here's why this matters to you. If those protectionist measures kick in,
It could mean higher prices for just, everyday stuff you buy, electronics, clothes, you name it. And remember how we talked about South Asia and Southeast Asia maybe benefiting?
right?
Well, that might mean they have to loosen up environmental regulations to attract those businesses.
Okay, so there's this trade-off between economic gains
Mm-hmm.
and protecting the environment. That's tough, especially for a region that's already dealing with the effects of climate change, right?
Yeah, it's a huge concern. I mean, developing Asia is incredibly vulnerable.
Hmm.
Rising sea levels, extreme weather, all that stuff.
Yeah.
If the U.S. steps back from climate action, it's going to be even harder for those countries to adapt.
It's like you're trying to run away from a wildfire and suddenly the wind changes direction and it's pushing the flames right at you.
Exactly. And I think this is a wake-up call for developing Asia. They really need to take the lead on climate action, regardless of what the U.S. does. They can't afford to wait around.
Okay, so, this report makes some pretty big predictions. But how much can we actually trust these economic models? I mean, we're talking about predicting the future, which seems kind of impossible.
Yeah, I mean, predicting the future is always tricky, right?
Right.
Even for economists with all their fancy models.
So should we just give up and say, who knows what's going to happen? Or is there some value in these projections, even if they're not perfect?
There's definitely value. Think of these models as ways to explore different possibilities.
Okay.
Kind of like trying out different routes on a map before you go on a trip.
Okay, so not a crystal ball, more like a compass.
Yeah, exactly. It's about understanding where things might be headed, not
Mhm.
about, knowing the future for sure.
Right.
And I think this report does a good job of like acknowledging the uncertainties and risks. It's not saying it has all the answers.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's zoom out a little and talk about the bigger picture. We've talked about economic impacts,
Hmm.
slower growth, trade getting messed up, inflation. But what about the actual people? How would all of this actually affect their lives?
That's the important question, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in all the numbers, but we got to remember there are real people behind all of that.
Right, exactly.
It's like those nature documentaries where they zoom in on a single ant carrying a crumb across a giant landscape.
Right, it's about those individual stories.
Exactly. Like, imagine a family in Indonesia, they make a living selling crafts to tourists.
Okay,
If a trade war means fewer tourists, that family's livelihood is directly impacted.
that's a really good example. It's not just about numbers, it's about people's lives.
Right. And that brings us to another important point, inequality. The report says some of these policy changes, especially protectionism, could actually make inequality worse, both within and between countries.
Okay, how would that happen? How would protectionism make inequality worse?
Well, think about tariffs on imported goods, making everyday stuff more expensive. Who do you think feels that the most?
Yeah, I'm guessing it's not the people who can already afford all that stuff.
Exactly. It hits lower income households the hardest because they spend a bigger chunk of their income on those basic things.
It's like making things even harder for people who are already struggling.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about consumers. Protectionism can mess with labor markets, leading to job losses, making it harder for people to find work and support their families.
That sounds like a recipe for, like, social unrest.
Exactly. So it's really important to think about who benefits and who loses from these policy shifts. We need to make sure everyone benefits from economic growth, not just a few, and that the most vulnerable people are protected.
Okay, so we've talked about the economic impacts, the human impact, the potential for inequality getting worse. Anything else we should be thinking about?
Well, there's that potential shift in environmental policies.
Right, we talked about that a bit.
Yeah, we talked about climate change, but there's also just like general environmental damage.
Like what?
Think deforestation, pollution, loss of biodiversity, all those things.
Right.
Developing Asia is already dealing with these things, and a second Trump administration, with its focus on deregulation and economic growth, could make those problems even worse.
It's like another trade-off, short-term economic gain for long-term environmental damage.
Exactly. It's a tough balance.
So what can be done? How can developing Asia deal with all these challenges and build a future that's, strong and sustainable?
That's the big question, right? The report doesn't have all the answers, but it does point to a few key things.
Okay, I'll listen.
First, diversification. Those economies that rely too much on exports to one country, like the PRC, are going to be more vulnerable.
Right.
They need to spread out their markets, their products, where their investments come from.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Second, innovation. Developing Asia needs to invest in education, technology, infrastructure, all that stuff to stay competitive in the global economy.
Basically, got to keep up with the times.
Exactly. And third, collaboration. These challenges can't be solved by countries acting alone. Developing Asia needs to work together more, share resources, all of that.
It sounds like we need a new kind of leadership, one that's about working together, being innovative, and thinking long term.
Exactly. And that brings up another crucial point, geopolitical stability. We've seen how economic tensions can escalate into political conflicts and even military stuff.
It's like the whole world is a powder keg.
Exactly. The report talks about several potential flashpoints that could get worse because of these policy shifts, like the trade tensions between the U.S. and the PRC. If those get worse under a second Trump administration, it could have a huge impact on the whole region.
It's like a big game of chess where every move could have all these unintended consequences. What other potential flashpoints should we be watching?
Well, there's the South China Sea, where China and several Southeast Asian countries have been fighting over territory for years. A more assertive U.S. foreign policy could make things even more tense there.
Okay, so that's one.
Who else? And then there's the Korean Peninsula. Tensions between North and South Korea are still really high. A change in U.S. policy toward North Korea could either calm things down or make them worse. It's hard to say.
So many potential problems. How can we even begin to make things more stable and fair in the world?
It's a complicated question. The report emphasizes the importance of talking to each other, cooperating, and sticking to shared values.
So basically, we need better leadership and diplomacy.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, especially in today's world, but we can't ignore it. We need leaders who are willing to think beyond their own countries and to prioritize everyone's well-being, no matter where they live.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. Economics, politics, the environment. What's the main takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about after listening to all of this?
I think the main takeaway is this. The future of developing Asia is tied to what the U.S. does, but it's not completely determined by them. The region has the power to shape its own future.
So there's reason to be both cautious and optimistic.
Yeah, exactly. There are definitely challenges, but there are also opportunities for innovation, collaboration, and positive change.
That's good to hear. But before we finish this deep dive, there's one more area I want to explore. We've talked about all the potential economic and political stuff,
Yeah.
but it seems like a second Trump administration would also, have an impact on social and cultural things in developing Asia too.
Right. It wouldn't just be about, trade deals and numbers. A second Trump administration would definitely affect like how people in developing Asia see themselves and the world.
So what kind of effects are we talking about?
Well, think about some of Trump's policies, like his tough stance on China and, his focus on national sovereignty. That
Hmm.
stuff resonated with some people, especially in countries like India and the Philippines.
I see.
It kind of tapped into a sense of national pride, like wanting a strong leader on the world stage. But at the same time, those policies worried other people. Like his rhetoric on immigration and trade made some people afraid of more xenophobia and protectionism. And you know how he was skeptical of things like the UN? That made some people worry about global cooperation falling apart.
So basically, people had mixed reactions, just like with the economic stuff. So how might a second Trump administration affect the relationship between the U.S. and developing Asia? Would it bring them closer or push them further apart?
That's a tough one. It really depends on how those policies are actually put into practice and how countries in the region react.
Okay, so let's play this out. What if Trump just goes all in on America first and gets even more confrontational with countries like China?
Well, in that case, we could see more tension, maybe even like a separation of the US and Chinese economies.
I,
And that would have huge ripple effects everywhere in developing Asia. Countries would have to pick sides, which could lead to more political division and instability.
so what if Trump takes a more, I don't know, practical approach, like focusing on individual deals with countries that are, on his side?
In that scenario, we might see the relationship between the US and developing Asia become more fragmented, every country for themselves kind of thing.
Yeah.
So countries would be trying to get the best deals for themselves, playing the game.
It sounds pretty chaotic. Okay, so let's bring this back down to earth.
Yeah.
What does all of this mean for the average person in developing Asia? How would their lives actually be affected?
Well, it could affect everything. I mean, the prices of things they buy, whether they can find a job, even how stable their government is. It's a
Right.
good reminder that even though these global power struggles might seem far away, they can really impact people's
It's
lives.
like a butterfly effect, right? Something small happens in one place and has ripple effects all over the world. So what can people do? How can they make a difference and help create a more just and fair world?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to stay informed and to really think critically about these issues. Don't just believe everything you hear.
Yeah.
People can support organizations working to make the world a better place, like groups promoting global cooperation, sustainable development, human rights, things like that. And they can hold their own leaders accountable, make sure they're making decisions that benefit everyone, not just a select few.
That's a good point. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of all this, but we all have a part to play. Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into how a second Trump administration could affect developing Asia. It's a lot to think about, that's for sure.
Definitely. This Asian Development Outlook report really highlights all the complexities and uncertainties of what might happen. And it's up to all of us to use that information wisely to try to create a better future for everyone.
Thanks for joining us today, and be sure to tune in next time for another deep dive into the forces shaping our world. Until then, stay curious and stay engaged.